She was dragged to the wagon in silence. He was mending a fence when he first saw her. Neither of them knew what the other had lost, but the wind knew. And before the sun set twice, a bargain sealed in desperation would change both of their fates forever. The slap echoed off the hills, so loud it seemed to shake the birds from the trees. Ruth staggered, her hand flying to her cheek, but she didn't fall. Not yet. Her sister Mercy shoved her from behind, sending her tumbling down the porch steps like a sack of grain. She landed hard in the dirt, her dress tearing, her knees scraping raw, but she didn't make a sound. "You shamed us," Mercy hissed, her arms crossed tight. "You brought a curse on this house." "I loved him," Ruth whispered, the words useless against their cold fury. "He lied," snapped Charity, the middle sister, "and you were fool enough to believe him. Now look at you, belly swollen with sin. No decent man will have you." From the side of the yard, their younger brother Abel watched, his knuckles white around the handle of a water pail. He said nothing. He never did. In their family, boys were taught to be silent unless they were reciting scripture under their dead father's watchful portrait. The wagon waited at the end of the path. At the reins sat Jedediah Crick, a sour-faced trader who dealt in livestock, timber, and sometimes, when the price was right, people. "This ain't right," Ruth trembled, pushing herself to her feet. "You're my sisters." "We were," Mercy said, stepping so close Ruth could smell the sweat of her righteousness. "But blood doesn't cover sin. You're not our family anymore." Charity shoved a small sack into Ruth's arms. It was light, too light, a change of clothes, a crust of bread, a half-frozen flask of water. "He'll give you $5 when he's tired of you," she said, her voice flat. "It's more than you deserve." They dragged her to the wagon and threw her into the back. Ruth clutched her belly as her side struck the rough wood. Jedediah just clicked his tongue and snapped the reins. The mule lurched forward, and the life Ruth had known disappeared behind her. She didn't cry, not until the house was just a blur. Not until the last thing she heard from home was the slamming of a door. They reached the trading post by dusk. It was nothing more than 3 rundown buildings and a handful of shivering goats. Jedediah exchanged a few words with a man near the well, then turned back to Ruth. "Come on," he grunted. "He's waiting." "Who?" she asked, her voice dry as dust. Jedediah scratched his chin. "Fella from up north. Said he needed help on his ranch. Told him I'd find someone." She wanted to run, but her sisters had made sure she had nowhere to go. No money, no horse, no coat thick enough to survive a single night. So she followed him. What choice did she have? They rode west as night fell. The hills grew darker, the wind colder. Somewhere in the distance, a lone rancher hammered a rail back into a broken fence. He moved with a quiet efficiency, a man used to hard work and harder pain. His name was Ward Ellis, and though he didn't know it yet, the woman headed his way would do more than just change his routine. She was about to shatter his entire world. He saw the wagon kicking up dust along the ridge, moving with the slow certainty of an approaching storm. Ward set his hammer down as Jedediah pulled the mule to a stop. "Got your help," the trader called out. "She's strong enough." Ward stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. He wasn't a man who trusted easily, and he sure as hell didn't take in strangers. He looked up at the figure climbing down from the wagon and froze. She was filthy, her dress torn, her face streaked with grime and shame. But she stood tall. She looked him right in the eye. "My name is Ruth," she said, and her voice didn't tremble. Ward blinked. "You got a last name?" "Don't think it matters anymore," she said flatly. Jedediah chuckled. "Told you she was bold." Ward didn't laugh. His eyes flicked down to her rounded belly, then back up to her face. He sighed, a sound heavy with a history she couldn't possibly know, and nodded once. "Come inside." The house wasn't much, but it was warm and clean, smelling of ash and pine. Ward pointed to a chair by the stove. "You can sit," he said. "I ain't gonna ask what brought you here." Ruth lowered herself slowly. "I'm not here to cause trouble." "I don't doubt that," Ward replied. She stole a glance at him. He was tall and lean, with rough hands and a beard that hadn't seen a comb in weeks. But there was something gentle in his movements, something tired. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Since my brother died last winter, Ward said simply. House ain't used to more than one pair of boots, but I reckon it'll manage. Later that night, Ruth lay awake on a narrow cot in a small room. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She could hear Ward moving in the other room, stoking the fire, locking the door. Safe sounds. Honest sounds. She curled an arm around her belly and whispered to the child inside, I don't know if this is the beginning or the end, but it's not the end of me. Outside the wind howled, but inside the fire held. And Ward Ellis, for all his silence, was already thinking about the girl who hadn't begged or cried. The girl who just stood there like a tree, refusing to break. A quiet rhythm started to form in the days that followed. Ward would rise before the sun to check his livestock. Ruth would be in the kitchen when he returned, coffee ready, biscuits in the oven. She scrubbed the floors, mended his torn shirts, and patched the worn curtains without ever being asked. It wasn't about earning her keep. It was about survival. It was about planting roots in a world that had tried to tear her out of the ground. She never asked if she could stay, and he never offered. They existed in a tense space between assumptions, neither of them willing to name what this strange arrangement was. Maybe because naming it would make it too real or too fragile. But the baby was coming, a reality that grew heavier with each passing day. One night, a fierce storm rolled in, lashing the cabin with wind and sleet. Ruth woke to the sound of the shutters rattling and went to stoke the fire. She found Ward already there, sitting in the dark, just staring into the embers. You sleep at all? She asked quietly. Some. She sat beside him, the fire warming her knees. A storm like this could tear the roof off back home, she murmured. Ward glanced at her. Where is home? She hesitated. Doesn't matter. I'm not welcome there anymore. He didn't push. He just nodded. Folks can be cruel. They say they do it for righteousness, she said bitterly, but that's just another word for punishment. Ward's jaw tightened. Ain't no verse I know that says to abandon the weak. Ruth blinked. She hadn't expected that from him. The truth in his voice settled something deep inside her. You ever been loved, Ward? The question hung in the air like a lit match. Once, he said after a long pause, a long time ago. What happened? She got sick. I couldn't stop it. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. The storm howled around them, but in that flickering silence something shifted. Not love, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. Just as the quiet settled between them, a new sound cut through the storm. Hooves, approaching fast. Ward was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the rifle from its place by the door. Ruth froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew that sound. It was the sound of trouble. If it's them, she whispered, don't let them take me. Ward looked down at her, his face a mask of stone. They won't. The door flew open, and the past came riding in. The man who stood on the porch wore a fine city coat, his hat tilted at an angle that defied the wind. He moved like a man who believed the world owed him whatever he wanted. Behind him, two other riders sat stiffly, their hands resting on their pistols. Ward didn't step outside. He stood in the doorway, the rifle held loosely at his side. Morning, the man called out, his smile all charm and no warmth. Name's Ezra Dole. I'm a man of business. I'm not buying, Ward said, his voice flat. Ezra chuckled. I think you might be housing something that belongs to others. A girl, name of Ruth Wainwright, heard she was spotted in Jedediah Crick's wagon. Ruth tensed behind Ward, her throat closing up. She ain't yours, Ward stated. Ezra's smile never faltered, but it turned brittle, like a shard of glass. She's a problem for people who solve problems. I've been paid to bring her back. It doesn't need to get ugly. She's not going anywhere with you, Ward said, his voice low and final. Ezra stared at him for a long, tense moment. Then he laughed, a cold, empty sound. Well, he said, mounting his horse, you've made your position clear. We'll be around, in case she changes her mind. He paused, his eyes locking with Ward's. Or you do. They rode off, disappearing into the snow as quickly as they'd appeared. Ward shut the door and bolted it. They'll be back, he said, and I won't talk so long next time. Ruth sank into a chair, shaking. What did they mean? She asked. Tying up loose ends? She stared at the floor, her voice barely a whisper. My sisters. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me erased. They're trying to marry into a wealthy family. An embarrassment like me. A baby with no father? It would ruin everything for them. So they found a way to make sure I could never come back. Ward stood over her, his shadow falling across the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a promise. They won't get you, he said. Not from here. That night, neither of them slept. Every creak of the cabin walls, every whistle of the wind, felt like a warning. The next morning, 3 sharp knocks on the door sent a jolt of fear through the cabin. Ward grabbed his rifle, but when he opened the door, it wasn't Ezra. It was Jedediah Crick. He stood on the porch, his face pale, his hat clutched in his hands. They're coming, he said, his voice ragged. Tonight. Ward pulled him inside. Who? Ezra. He brought more men. 6 at least. I heard them talking at the trading post. They're going to come in quiet. Take the girl. No law, no trace. Ward's face went cold. Why are you telling us this? Jedediah looked down at his boots, shame etched on his face. I ain't proud of what I do for a living, but selling her, that was wrong. I don't want any more blood on my hands. By nightfall, the cabin was a fortress. The windows were boarded, the fire was doused, and the lamps were dark. Ruth sat on the floor, clutching her belly, while Ward and Jedediah moved like ghosts, checking the perimeter, loading rounds. Then they heard it, the slow, deliberate crunch of hooves on snow. 6 riders stopped just beyond the porch. Let's not make this messy, Ward, Ezra's voice called out, smooth as ever. She belongs elsewhere, and I've been paid to collect. Ward stepped outside, his rifle held steady. You take one more step, he said, and I shoot. Ezra laughed. We both know you're not that type. You don't know me, Ward replied. Ezra motioned and 2 of his men dismounted. Ward aimed. The first man dropped before he even hit the porch steps. Gunfire erupted. Jedediah threw open the door, firing twice. The second man fell screaming. The others scattered, diving for cover as Ward stepped off the porch, his rifle blazing. The world dissolved into chaos. Ruth covered her ears, her heart thundering against her ribs. Then just as suddenly, silence. When it was over, 4 men lay still in the snow. The rest had fled into the darkness. Ward stood alone in the moonlight, his rifle lowered, his chest heaving. Jedediah joined him, bleeding from his shoulder but grinning like a fool. You're insane, Ellis, he chuckled, but I'm glad I came. Inside, Ruth wept silently, not from fear but from something else, something deeper. Ward came back inside, his face covered in snow and ash. It's done, he said. Ruth looked up at him. Is it? He didn't answer. He just knelt beside her and gently took her hand. You're safe, he whispered. For now. Outside, the snow began to fall again, quiet and soft, covering the blood, the bodies, and the trail they wouldn't be following anymore. They were safe, but they both knew it was a temporary peace. A man like Ezra didn't just disappear. He regrouped. He'll be back, Ward said, his voice grim as they stood in the quiet cabin, the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air. And he'll bring more than 6 men next time. We can't stay here, Ruth whispered. Jedediah, clutching his bleeding shoulder, pointed a shaky finger towards the mountains. There's a cabin, up in Hollow Ridge. Old trapper's place. No road, no trail. Just trees. We'll need a wagon, Ward said, his eyes on Ruth's swollen belly. She can't ride. They left before sunrise, a small cart and a stubborn mule their only hope. The journey was brutal. The path was barely a path at all, just a track worn by animals through thick snow and thorns. The cart jolted and bucked, every bump sending a fresh wave of pain through Ruth's body. But she didn't complain. This wasn't about comfort. This was about survival. The cabin was little more than a one-room shack, tucked between 2 massive boulders. It was cold, dusty, and filled with the ghosts of whoever had lived there before. But it was hidden. By dusk, Ward had fixed the door and gotten a fire going. They were safe. For now. That night, as the wind howled outside, Ruth sat awake, her hand resting on her stomach. "You're coming soon," she whispered to the child inside. I don't know what kind of world this is, but I promise it won't be the one I came from." The wind rattled the cabin, but it didn't shake her. She was no longer the girl who had been cast out by her sisters. She was something else now, something harder, something stronger. At first light, the world shattered again. It wasn't a gunshot that woke Ward. It was Ruth's scream. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, but it wasn't an attack. It was the baby. "It's happening," she gasped, her face pale with sweat. "It's too soon." Hours blurred into a nightmare of pain and fear. Ward, a man who had seen the horrors of war, was terrified. He boiled water, tore cloth, held her hand as she squeezed hard enough to break bone. "I can't," she sobbed. "You can," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "You already are." By nightfall, the child came into the world. A girl, small and red and angry at the cold. Ruth wept with exhaustion and relief. Ward sat on the floor beside her, holding the newborn in his arms as if she were made of spun glass. "She's perfect," he whispered. Ruth leaned back, her eyes closing. "She's free." "What will you name her?" Ward asked. Ruth stared at the rough-hewn rafters, and a single word came to her lips. "Grace." In the days that followed, a new kind of quiet settled over the cabin. It was a quiet filled with the soft cries of a newborn and the unspoken understanding between two people who had been through hell together. Ward, a man who had never held a baby in his life, found himself mesmerized by Grace. He would sit for hours just watching her sleep, her tiny fingers clutching his rough coat. Ruth watched him, a faint smile playing on her lips. "She likes you," she said one morning. "Sometimes babies just know who's safe." But they both knew that safety was an illusion. Peace on the frontier never lasted long. It was Jedediah who brought the news. He stumbled up the hill 2 weeks later, his coat torn, his lips split. "They're coming," he gasped, collapsing into Ward's arms. "Ezra. He never left. He's been searching. He found a trapper who knows these hills. They'll be here by nightfall." The cabin became a war camp. Ward boarded the windows, laid out ammunition, and set fire traps around the perimeter. "If anything happens," he told Ruth, "take the baby and run. There's a path behind the ridge that leads down to the creek. Hide there." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not asking." They stared at each other, the weight of everything they hadn't said hanging between them. By dusk, the hooves came, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow. "Let's not make this messy, Ward," Ezra's voice called out. "I want the girl, the child too. The family wants a clean slate." "I have a slate of my own to clean," Ward muttered and stepped outside. The night exploded in a blaze of gunfire. Jedediah fired from the window, taking down one rider before the others could scatter. Ward moved with the deadly precision of a soldier, dropping another man before diving for cover as bullets splintered the porch. Inside, Grace wailed. Ruth clutched the pistol Ward had left for her. If they got inside, she would fight. She would not let them take her daughter. The battle raged, a brutal, chaotic dance of death in the moonlight. Jedediah went down, a bullet in his shoulder, but he was still grinning. "You're insane, Ellis," he chuckled. "But I'm glad I came." It came down to Ward and Ezra. "She's nothing," Ezra screamed, his gun empty. "A mistake, a stain." "She's a mother," Ward said and pulled the trigger. When it was over, Ward stood in the silence, the snow falling softly around him, covering the bodies, the blood, and the trail that no one would be following anymore. He went back inside, covered in snow and ash. "It's done," he said. Ruth looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Is it?" He didn't answer. He just knelt beside the cradle and gently touched Grace's tiny hand. "She's safe," he whispered. "For now." They buried the dead at first light, not for mercy, but for necessity. Ward and Jedediah worked in silence, the ground hard with frost, the air thick with what they had done. The days that followed were quiet, but it was an earned quiet, a peace bought with blood. They didn't speak of Ezra or the fight. They didn't have to. The silence was filled with the soft sounds of a baby gurgling and the steady rhythm of their new life. Grace grew. She learned to smile, her toothless grin a beacon of light in their small dark cabin. Ward, a man who had forgotten how to feel, found himself captivated. He would hold her for hours, her tiny fist wrapped around his calloused finger. Jedediah, his shoulder healing slowly, watched them from his corner by the fire. "You know," he said one night, "I wasn't always a traitor. I had a wife, 2 boys. The fever took them all. I started wandering then. Figured if I kept moving, the grief couldn't catch me." "Did it work?" Ruth asked softly. Jedediah looked at the fire. "For a while. That's all we get, I think. A while." One night Ruth stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars. Ward joined her, as he always did. "I used to believe God had a plan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Even when my sister sold me, I thought maybe he was testing me. Now I'm not so sure." Ward was quiet for a long time. "Maybe it's not a test," he said finally. "Maybe it's planting. Sometimes the Lord doesn't strike. He buries you deep, lets you crack and split and rot in the dark so you can grow stronger, wiser, harder to break." Ruth smiled, a real smile this time. "I'm trying to believe that." "Me too," he said. The snow began to melt, slowly at first, then all at once. The world around them came alive again. Jedediah announced he was leaving. "Time to stop running," he said, packing his bedroll. "Maybe find some roots of my own." He hugged Ruth goodbye, a rough, clumsy embrace. "You tell that little one I remember the fire in her eyes," he said. "Don't you ever let her lose it." Spring brought wildflowers and the sound of birds. Ruth would walk with Grace strapped to her chest, whispering stories of a garden they would plant, of chickens they would raise, of a swing Ward would build. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the sky painted in shades of gold and purple, Ruth leaned her head against Ward's shoulder. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. "Used to think I was done," he said, his voice rough. "After my wife, after the war. But then you showed up. Do you regret it?" "No," he said without a moment's hesitation. "Not for a second." "Then don't go quiet on me now, Ward Ellis," she said, looking up at him. "What are you asking, Ruth?" "I'm asking if you'd marry me." Ward blinked, his face unreadable in the fading light. He looked at Ruth, at the strength in her eyes, at the sleeping child in her arms. He looked at the cabin, the trees, the vast empty land that was now somehow full. He had been sold a woman like she was cattle, but in the end she was the one who had bought him back from the dead. "Yes," he said, his voice cracking just a little. "Yes, I will." They stood there, the three of them, in the middle of nowhere and everywhere. No church bells, no family, just the wind in the trees and the stars beginning to appear. She had been sold like she was nothing, but the man who took her in had seen everything. And what they built together, in that small cabin on a forgotten ridge, wasn't just a refuge. It was a life. If you enjoyed this story of survival and second chances, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what other tales of redemption are waiting to be told out here on the frontier. Thanks for listening.